Well, good morning and welcome to Wednesday, October 14th, as we continue to have long lines at the early voting. We tend to uh, enjoy these moments. Well, today, today's one of those days that it happened. Walked out of the house, forgot my computer, and so yeah, it's one of those days. Um, thankful for technology that we can accomplish these things in other ways. So I'll have to make the drive back to the house before long, pick up my computer so I can do the things that I need to do on this Wednesday. But wanted to go ahead and take the time now to spend with you and to share with you some things. When we talk about building relationships, I think we need to be mindful that relationships are extremely important. Relationships are exactly the things that our community needs, our church needs. We all need relationships, but sometimes we forget in that relationships are where it is found to be most helpful. Sometimes we get involved in so many other things that we just forget that building new relationships, building strong relationships is incredibly important, and want to just spend a moment today reminding us. I was reading in our daily reading, finishing up Second Timothy today, and I just got to thinking as Paul is writing this, so often, because we read for content a lot of times, because we read scripture legalistically, because we read scripture in these kinds of ways in a very linear fashion. I think, we want to learn from scripture, and I think we should be learning from scripture. However, in the process of doing that, I think sometimes we can miss the emotion that is involved in writing scripture. It is God breathed, absolutely, but people are used by God to write these things, and they are of incredible importance, and we need to be following scripture. I want to encourage us to not negate the importance of the emotional part of that. What do I mean by that? Well, Second Timothy, most people will believe Second Timothy is the final writing of the Apostle Paul before his death. It's the last thing he wrote. It's kind of his last words. It's his life epitaph. It is, these final words, and he shares them with young Timothy. And I think it's important for us to understand not only that this is a mentor role. I think we need to understand that this is Timothy hearing these words. And it's always an intriguing situation when we think about how these scriptures would have been read and how these would have been received and who would have heard them. Timothy, First Timothy and Second Timothy, are very personal. And oftentimes people will look at these two and say, okay, it's a preacher talking to a preacher. What good is that to me? And I understand that to a degree, that these are organizational, administrative, leadership writings. And for some, it may not seem dramatically important. However, when you look at the depth of relationship that Paul had, he called him my son in the spirit, my son in the Lord, my son in, it's not physically his son, but he treated him as such. Now, I've had the privilege of not only having a great father, but I've had a great father-in-law. And it's been a relationship that has I have welcomed and enjoyed now for 26 years. And thinking through how this relationship of Paul and Timothy is, it's not just Paul saying, do this, do this, do this, do this. I don't think that that's the nature of this, nor do I think this is how Timothy would have heard it. Timothy would have heard this in a very personal, relational way. And so I think when we read through that, we need to bear in mind that there's relationship here. Now, what does this mean for October 14th, 2020? What does this mean in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a powerless church, an uninfluential church time in America? What difference does that make? Well, it reminds us of the importance of relationships. We need to be loving our neighbor. It is a great commandment. It is what we are called to do. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two things swing the rest of the law and prophets. And these are the hinges of the door that we need to be mindful of. Jesus says, there's not a great chasm between these two commandments. The second is like to it, it says. So Jesus basically is saying that loving God and loving our neighbor, while I'm not going to say they are equal, they are very important. Jesus is saying, look, these are two things that we need to deal with. You need to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And you need to love your neighbor. In fact, if I love God and don't love my neighbor, there's a problem. If I love my neighbor, but I don't love God, that's just humanitarianism. And there you have a problem also. So what does all this mean? Well, it just got me to thinking, and I wanted to share a few thoughts with us today, that if we're going to build strong relationships, if you personally are going to build strong relationships, or if we as a church are going to build strong relationships with our community, that's our neighbor corporately. You have personal, there is also corporate. As you are a part of a local church, we have a responsibility to reach into our neighborhood, our community that we are a part of. What are some thoughts there? Well, first of all, we need to unpack this concept of love. If I'm going to love my neighbor, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, first of all, that means that I need to learn about my neighbor. I need to learn who they are. I need to know their names. I need to know what's going on in the sense of, be neighborly. There was a time when everybody knew everybody on the block. Everybody took care of everybody's kids on the block. Everybody took care of everybody's business on the block, And today we have secluded ourselves. Me too. We've secluded ourselves in such a way that we don't know anybody. In fact, I would suggest to you that loving your neighbor is so important. Now, hear me out. If the only friends that you have, that you spend any time with, are only at your church, we're doing it wrong. We're doing it wrong. Think about it. If Matthew had converted, Jesus says, come follow me, and he came to follow Jesus. If he had abandoned all his relationships, we today might have applauded him and said, hey, that's awesome that you're giving up all of the negative and all those sinful people and all those lost people. Come, be a part of this community, love who we are, drop everything, and now you're a part of the church. You know what we would say to somebody who says, my child has joined this group, and now he or she has isolated themselves from all of their friends, isolated themselves from their family, isolated themselves from the world. They've insulated themselves in this group. You know what we call that? We call that a cult. I don't want to be a cult. I want to be a Christian. I don't want to be a cult. I want us to be the church of the living God. To be the church of the living God means that we love our neighbor, which means I have to learn who they are. I have to learn more about them. I have to know them. Now, whether I'm talking personally or as the church body, as a group of people, we need to learn who our neighbor is. We need to understand. To love them, we have to start learning who they are. And I don't mean to sit back in our own isolation and say, oh, yeah, I know who they are. Well, do we? Do we know our neighbor? Do we know our own community? This is critical. Because the next thing that we need to do, if we're going to build strong relationships, is begin to listen to our community. We need to listen to our community, listen to our neighbor. To love them, to build strong relationship and love them is not only to learn about them and learn who they are, but it is to listen to them. Really listen. Listen with your heart, not listen with listening with with waiting. You know, sometimes what we do, this is what we do, isn't it? We listen so that we can interject. We just listen long enough. We're only listening deep enough for them to take a breath so I can say what's on my mind. No, no, no. We need to listen with our heart. We need to feel what they're saying. I think many times right now people are up in arms. They are rioting. They are protesting. We have the Black Lives Matter movement because they, as a people, do not feel heard. We need to listen to our neighbors. We need to listen to them. To love them, we need to listen to them. We need to walk with them and to live with them in community. This is how we love one another. But I don't think Jesus just meant in isolation in our own little huddle group. I think he wants us to love our neighbor. And as his parable goes, that neighbor is sometimes somebody that you wouldn't think, and they're not a part of your group. They're outside of the circle. They're outside of the group. We need to be loving our neighbor, which means I have to learn who they are. I need to listen to them and then live with them, sit with them in community. Linger with them, spend time with them. But you know what that means? That means we might have to, as a church, adjust our scheduling to afford you the opportunity to do that. Because if we keep you at the church house 3 nights a week, how is that really affording you an opportunity to build a strong family, to build strong relationships with your neighbors, to build strong relationships in the community? If we are always seeking to fill our minds with information by being at the church house, if we're only seeking to control the church house by having our committee meetings all the time, how is that? If we overschedule church, how can I then go be a Christian? Being a Christian doesn't mean that I'm spending all my time at church. Being a Christian means I go love God by loving my neighbor. Think about that. That's a radical thought. And yet it's an ancient faith. If we want to hearken back to the good old days, let's go back to the 1st century, not just the last century, and look and see how it was done. Let's look and see how the originator of the thought told us to do it. Live in community, listen to your community, learn from and with your community. This is loving your neighbor. This reduces relational dissonance in your life, in your family, in your home, in your community. This is the way. This is the way of Christ. May we go and do the same. You guys have a great day, and let's love our neighbor.